All right, so you're comfortable with your calligraphy and you want to start mixing it with block letters, but your block letters suck. So how do you start actually doing block letters properly and making sure they look good so you can mix them with your calligraphy for projects? I'm Becca with the Happy Ever Crafter, and in this video I'm going to show you my step-by-step process for learning really pretty block letters. Let's jump right in. So I get a ton of questions about my block lettering and how I managed to make it look so neat. And what I say next might totally shock you, but it's completely and 100% about practice. So I personally spent 4 years in university doing architectural drafting, which involved a lot of meticulous and perfect block letters. And the way I was taught to do it was to just sit down for hours and hours and do it over and over and over again. And personally, I loved that, but most people hated it. So if you're watching this, I'm willing to bet you would rather just get a few quick tips to help you improve your block lettering. And so here's my step-by-step process. So for this step, you're going to need paper that has guidelines on it. So I'm using Rhodia paper, which is just a high quality paper, and it has a grid on it, which makes it easier to do precise block lettering. But if you're using a paper that has no guidelines, or if you don't have access to any paper that does, just make sure you draw yourself a grid before you get started. You don't want to be working on blank paper. You're also going to need any monoline pen or pencil. It could literally be anything. I'm going to be using a Sharpie just because it's a good thick pen that'll be able to show you really clearly on the screen. But you could use literally anything. So this is just like a ballpoint pen. You could use micron pens, which are awesome, or you could even use the smaller tip of a Tombow dual brush pen. What you don't want to use though is a brush pen. So you don't want anything flexible. That'll make it really hard to practice block letters. So a monoline pen and grid paper. So first step, what you're going to do is practice a series of really basic shapes and lines. So this part's going to feel a little bit meticulous, but it's really important to get this down before you try and do your own block lettering. So the first one is just going to be a line in an upwards direction and a line in a downwards direction. So just grab your pen and do a whole row of each of those. Then once you've done both of those, I want you to take a different colored pen, so it could be red, could be anything else, and just go through and sort of take a peek and look at what you did well and badly on different ones. So this is going to feel a little silly, especially with these straight lines, but get really picky. So like, for example, on this one, I started a little bit off to the side and I was a little bit shaky here. And on some of these, I didn't start completely right at the top. I could have done a better job at going from the top to the bottom really nicely. This one also came off of the angle here a little bit. So just take note of what you did right and wrong in these. And then the other thing I want you to note is which one of these you felt more comfortable with. So were you more comfortable going in an upwards direction or a downwards direction? And for me, I was much more comfortable going in a downwards direction. So I'm just going to remember that and put a little star beside that one. Then you're going to do the exact same thing with all of these different shapes. So again, go in an upwards direction and a downwards direction on all of these. So right off the bat, one thing I'm noticing about myself personally is that I tend to enjoy doing my lines in a downwards direction better than an upwards direction. So that's just personal preference, and it's something that you're only going to get to know when you practice properly this way. The other thing I want to mention about when you're working on these things is it can be really hard to be consistent with your angles, especially on these ones. So one thing that I like to tell people too is as you're doing straight lines, try and look at the end point as you're working. So if I'm starting down here and I'm struggling to get a straight line up, if I'm working along here, I have my eyes on this point at the end. So I know exactly where I want my pen to go. So you're going to continue with doing the same thing on the rest of these lines. Now we're at a horizontal one, so I just want you to do some that are starting from the right to the left and some that are starting from the left to the right. And sorry, I said that opposite, but you know what I mean. And then lastly, you're going to do the same thing with these rounded shapes at the bottom. So I want you to start some going on the right side of the circle and some going on the left side of the circle. Then I want you to do ovals in two different directions. So you're going to do some going counterclockwise and some going clockwise. So as you can tell in these practice examples, I have figured out where I'm feeling more comfortable. So for example, you'll see that I was much better at doing my ovals counterclockwise than I was clockwise. And I really liked moving in a downwards direction instead of an upwards direction. So the point of this exercise is to get familiar with doing straight lines and rounded lines, and also just to get that muscle memory built in for doing non-shaky lines and understanding where you feel more comfortable. So if you're doing this exercise and you're feeling very uncomfortable with it, or you're really, really shaky at first, you can also do it using a ruler and then gradually get away from using the ruler and start doing it freehand. So you might need to practice this over and over and over again before you're ready to move on to letters, which we're going to do next. Step 2 is to print off a font that you like. So open up a word processor on your computer and type the letters A to Z. And I would recommend using a sans serif font. Some good basic fonts that you can use: Helvetica, Arial, Geneva, Avenir, Source Sans, or Proxima Nova. So I'm going to use the last one, Proxima Nova, in my example, but you can choose whichever one you like best or use a totally different font if you like. I also like to print mine in two different sizes, so one bigger for practice and then one smaller to work with a scale that you'd be more likely to use in your actual everyday writing. So play with that sizing until you fill up as much of the page as possible and then print it off. Step 3 is to trace over and practice the font you just printed. So what you're going to do is put a piece of marker paper or tracing paper over top of this. This is the marker paper that I use. It's just by Canson, and you can use any marker paper or tracing paper you want. It really doesn't matter for this step. So I'm just going to put a piece of that over top, and then I'm going to use a marker and another, I'm just using red because I want to, but you can use any pen, to draw guidelines over the top, the middle, and the bottom of all of those letters. So you'll notice here that I'm going slightly above and below each of the letters. You don't really want to be right on top. And same with the middle, I'm going slightly under that middle line. So So I'm looking at the H here, I'm right under it so that I can get my line underneath it. And same thing at the bottom, just slightly underneath. Now for these smaller letters, because they're so tiny, I don't usually draw the middle line in. You can if you want, but for this example, I'm just going to do the top and the bottom. Then once you have your guidelines, you're going to actually go through and trace all of these letters. Now the key here is to do it mindfully. You don't want to just trace and not realize what you're doing. You want to be thinking about the shape of the letters, the way they're built up, where those middle lines are landing, how they're rounded, and how all of them are built. And you're actually kind of studying these as opposed to just tracing them over and phoning it in. So make sure you go nice and slow and really think about the shapes and using those directions that you preferred in step 1. So the E and the F are a perfect example of little nuances that you want to notice as you're doing this. So for example, on this F, if I were to draw a line from the end of that top line straight down, you would notice that that second bar is actually a little bit shorter. And so in working through these letters and playing with tracing them, I want you to notice things like that because that's going to make a big difference in how perfect your block letters look. Then once you've done your big letters, you can carry on and do the small ones as well. And for me, I'm going to keep doing this with a Sharpie, but you might notice that you want to use a smaller pen or a pen with a different line weight to get those smaller letters. And same thing here, you really want to be noticing the little nuances of the letters. Step 4 is going to be really similar. So now I want you to take your traced version and put another piece of marker paper over top and then trace those red guidelines again. Then once you have your guidelines, you're going to take your original traced sheet and you're either going to put it to the side so you can still see it as a reference, or you're going to put it completely out of your memory if you think you've memorized all of the letters, and you're going to do them all freehand. So as you're doing this, you want to really think about all the shapes of the letters that you just learned. So I'm just going to go through them, and you'll notice that mine will not be as perfect as the traced version, but they're going to be based off of that. Next, I'm going to do the same thing with the smaller version. that is the end of step 4. So if you put them beside each other, this is my traced version, this is my freehanded version, you can see some little differences and imperfections in my freehanded version, but overall this is pretty close to the original. So you might feel like you need to do that multiple times, and that's totally normal. And after you're comfortable with doing it with this as a reference, take this out of the picture, put it away completely, and try to do it from memory. Step 5 is to do the exact same thing we just did, except now you're going to do it with full words. So this is going to help you practice not only the letter shapes, but also the spacing between the letters. And so spacing is something huge that you'll notice when you start working, that if your spacing is consistent, it'll look a lot nicer. So it's a really good idea to just print out a list of random words. You can go to a website, like go on Google and type in random word generators, and it'll give you weird words like this, and then just practice them and take note of the spacing at the same time as the letter shapes. So I'm just going to put another piece of tracing paper over top. I'm going to draw my red lines, and then I'm going to trace these and freehand these. Okay, so guidelines are drawn, and now I'm going to trace. Okay, so I've gone through the tracing, and now I'm going to do these freehanded. And remember that I'm paying attention to the spacing and not only the shapes of the letters this time. So let's see how accurate I can get it to look like the original. Now, one thing I notice when I'm starting to do this is little mistakes that I've made, and they're important to note as you're working through them. So it's really, really minor stuff, but if you look, for example, my spacing between my N and my C right here is a lot bigger than this one. So I would go through with my red, actually maybe I'll do it with a blue pen so that it's easier to see. And I would correct myself on these things as I go. So here I notice it, and then my spacing between the top of my C and my E is way bigger here too. So my C should have been wider, and my E should have started a little bit closer to it. So good corrections to make as you go. Now same thing on this letter. My O was a little bit wonky, and so the spacing here ended up weird, and I'm also a little bit too far over here. Okay, so again, same thing. You want to look at the traced version versus the freehanded version and correct yourself. And then you can obviously print out lots of different words and keep practicing this. And you can practice also with the smaller scale if you like. But this is a really, really great way to practice your spacing and take note of where you're having issues. So if you look at this, for example, you can tell that I have trouble with a lot of my rounded letters and the spacing around those. And so that would be something that I would want to practice. Then lastly, once you're comfortable with the style you've been learning, you can do the same process with tons of different fonts and come up with different bits and pieces that you liked from each one. So as you're working through different styles, you'll naturally pick apart letters that you like from some and some that you dislike from others, and gradually put them together into your own kind of style. So some easy things that you can also start to play with in your styles are the slant. So you can take some letters and slant some of the horizontal lines or even the vertical lines and start to give them a little bit more flair. You can play with the weight. So of course you can make them wider, heavier, thinner, and make them more into sort of what we call bubble letters, or we called bubble letters when we were kids, but just make them heavier and that kind of thing. And then the other really easy way to change up your style is to change the height of your crossbar. So if you take that horizontal line in the middle of any letters that have it and move it up or down, it can really change the style of your letters. Then step 7, of course, is to just repeat. So find different fonts, trace them over, study them, and then start to get really familiar with all of your letters. And that's it. Again, it's all about practice. So hopefully these warm-ups and skills tracing will help you with your freehand. So hopefully that video was helpful for you. And if you're ready to keep going and just playing with more lettering styles, make sure you check out this video where I go over how to do bounce lettering. And I'll see you next time.